I've been thinking about tools and terminals. This conversation is really central, the relationship you're discussing between your business model, the incentives that creates, and the effects it has on your product. So, to go a little bit into what I mean when I say tools versus terminals, a tool is like some sort of technology that is like fully owned and controlled by the user of the tool. A hammer is a tool because I can hold and touch it and take it with me places. I paid for it. It is mine. I can customize it. I write and label on all my tools so that I know that it's mine if I go anywhere with it. And even the components of the tool are mine. If I wanted to use the head of the hammer for something completely different, I could cut it off and use it for parts. A terminal, in some ways, on the other hand, is a technology that's not owned or controlled by the user. It's like something that's rented by the user and is accessible only when the third party makes it available. I think we can all in our digital age understand how this relates. The current landscape of all of the stuff that's on the internet is like these subscription models, these kind of like web only portals, like these things that we're using that often are called tools. And often we as founders build them with the marketing language of this is a tool is really a terminal. It's something that's not modifiable or owned by the user in question. That presents not only a philosophical, interesting argument, but also a real practical argument and way to think about how you build product as a founder and as a company. But yeah, Henry, you're the one that kind of found this to be like a really resonant point in my newsletter. What did you really take away from this?
Really liked the comparison, mostly because it was just a big shock. I thought it was a bit controversial because of the point of we
Tool.
all say, but the reality is, no, you're not building a tool at all. This isn't something that you have no or control or ownership over. Your hammer analogy I really like, but the terminal of the hammer would be if you could only go into a
Mhm.
room and use the hammer at a certain workshop. You don't have ownership over that hammer, you don't have control over it outside space that you're
Which
renting.
can be fun.
Um,
Which
in
can
the
be fun.
digital
Maker
yes,
spaces exist to solve
totally.
this problem. Exactly. I don't need to own a
Mhm.
hammer. I just need access to it
Yep,
when I need access to it.
totally. And so it really depends on what is the use case and what is your true value proposition. Are you saying this is something that you can use forever and always and it's going to solve
Mhm.
this point blank? Or is this something that you need to be reliant on the business long term in order to fulfill? I think the first positive of what a terminal can be is when that tool is being
Mhm.
constantly updated. It's a new tool, it's just getting started to build out a ton of different features to solve many
Yeah.
problems in one space. In that
Yeah.
case,
Someone's
it
gonna
kind of makes sense to have a
exactly.
low
Someone's gonna
monthly
upgrade your
cost.
hammer over time. They're gonna add new features to your hammer.
Yeah,
That's a cool concept. Mhm.
cheaper for me to get started to use that tool within this terminal. Good. I like it. In many ways, I think you've already said we're all kind of building terminals and all of the use cases out there or big successful companies are terminals. I feel like right off the bat, there's two potential solutions, and you either try to solve that control issue or you try to solve that ownership issue. For the ownership issue, I feel like founders like myself might consider a one time payment for
Totally.
this terminal
Lifetime
access.
membership.
So you have
Mhm.
a lifetime license. Yes. Does that, you know, fix the problem in your mind, even though it's only, you don't have control over it? We're still going to update it or not update it, but you have ownership over it. We're not going to come asking for more money to log in the future. Is that a good thing to
I think that's a good
prioritize
thing
as
to
a founder?
prioritize. There's also some data to suggest that having those lifetime memberships early in your product development, people actually will buy them, and that will help you fund the development in the early days of your product. Where I think it
Sure.
breaks
Yeah.
down, especially in software, is that the thing that you're also selling when you sell software is you're selling support. Sometimes support is one to one, like someone has a question and you answer the question, or you solve something like within a bug or whatever it is. And other times that support is like literally for all customers, like fixing issues based on like the perceived value exchange or the promised value exchange. And there's errors. Software is a living, breathing thing. It is not like a hammer. And so it needs constant updates. And to try to have an idea of a lifetime membership where, I'm just going to give you this thing and then you'll give me money and then we'll be done. I don't know if there's a lot of modern examples where that works well. I will almost immediately give you one, though, which is, yeah, Affinity, the company that makes a lot of the Adobe competitors, which if we had to pick one company that I think is the worst example of like tools and terminals, it would be Adobe. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead.
So, yeah, Affinity Designer is a service that I pay for or paid for about 4 years ago. I paid for the first version of this when I was trying to get myself off of all of the Adobe products because they were absurdly expensive. Um, and yeah, I paid for a license to that version of the software. I got, I think, updates for maybe 2 years or something. And then if I wanted to get a new version of the product. Really, that's it. If I wanted to get a new version of the product to continue to get security software updates, whatever, I'd have to pay for the next version of the software, which is what Adobe used to do for, I think, 15 something years before they switched to the Creative Cloud model. So the are examples of this working. I'm not sure if it works for all software, especially software that requires a connection to a database. If you think about Notion, that requires a lot of syncing infrastructure and servers to host your data and to be able to share it with other people. That's constantly running cost for the company. And I do think that it should be fair to have you pay for that cost continually as long as you're using those like parts of the product. And so there's, I think, definite trade offs. And I'm not sure if it's a clear, easy answer of, yeah, we should just sell software like we did in the 90s and it'll come on a DVD and you'll be able to install it on all the computers. There are real people that like,
Yeah,
there's a real community trying to bring that type of relationship back between software developers and users. And I'm not completely convinced that works in our new landscape of what we expect from our software. What do you think about that, Henry?
I agree. I think that it's an option. Maybe you
Mhm.
consider it as a founder, but you also have to remember that back in the '90s, software was really
Exactly.
expensive, right? Hundreds of dollars for these licenses. And so now it's way more cost effective to use a software or experiment with many different types of software to figure out which one you want to use. So the barrier of entry being lower, a good thing most of the time. At least
Mhm.
that's what's played out in the market. But if we don't assess the ownership issue, what
Mhm.
about the control issue? The thing that I think about is making the code base
Mhm.
open source so you can now modify and control this software. Is that something that you think holds water
I
as
think
a
that
solution?
in my most ideal recesses of my mind, it does. I love to think about this issue of how do you enable a populace that most people like don't know how to write code, have no idea how this stuff works? How do you enable them to manipulate and control their tools and make them customized to themselves? And I think there are some apps that do this relatively well, mostly workplace tools that are supposed to be customizable, but there's always a limit in terms of what you're allowed to do is actually a feature rather than it is a designed part of the product for it to be flexible and manipulatable in that way. Unlike being able to take a saw to the top of your hammer and take off the hammerhead. Like that's a difficult problem to try to solve technically in terms of, you know, yeah, theoretically, like, I think it's, like, a total jam, and you mentioned, like,
Yeah.
open source does allow you to get under the hood. You can like, what's called forking a code base, which is, like, making another version of the code that you can make changes to and then publish for other people to make changes to. The problem with that, obviously, though, is that it requires people to know how to code. Now, some people will say and argue that with AI tools and all these things, like everyone's gonna be able to know how to code. I don't super believe that. Just because we have Google Translate doesn't mean that everyone can speak German.
No, no, 100%. Yeah, as a non-technical founder, I don't necessarily believe that that access to development is gonna happen anytime soon, even with the advances. It sounds like tools versus terminals. There are some ways that you can make your terminal a
Mhm.
little bit more like a tool, but not all the time, not in every instance. There's pros and cons,
Yeah,
obviously, with both approaches, but I really like that framework for myself and for other founders to be
totally.
just cognizant of, where we might say it's a tool, but understanding what a terminal actually is and how that influences your
Yeah.
design and your revenue model, I think it's interesting. But do you have any advice on how we can try to make more tools and less terminals if terminals truly are a problem or the
That's
end
one of the
user?
things that I'd maybe push back on because I'm not here to say that terminals are all inherently bad.
Okay.
Right? I think that
Okay,
terminals
good.
in a technical sense make a lot of sense in the internet. Where I think it gets bad is exactly like
Yeah.
you're saying, the financial incentives of a business tend to try to maximize for total amount of profit versus least amount of cost. And like to go back to the case of Adobe, like I think Adobe right now was, outed as having 19 people that work full time on After Effects, which is their video effects processor. And people pay $700 a month for access to the full
Yeah.
Adobe suite, but like including After Effects, which is a big, huge player, like almost the still dominant player in the VFX industry. And is that the right relationship in terms of like the amount people are paying for the amount of work still being done to maintain that piece of software? Maybe not. Thing that I would say in terms of like how do we create access or promote development of tools, right, versus just terminals. I think a lot of it does then fundamentally come down to that relationship between the business model and the product. In a world where you are a company that is owned in some way or shares access to the ownership of the product itself, in this case if we're talking about software, like access to the code or the actual like intellectual property of the code, you do make that more of a tool, you push it more like in that direction. If your business is run as a cooperative in which your users of the software actually own the software and can direct its development and where the money goes in terms of that profit to continued maintenance and development relationship, like you get more towards tool. And yeah, exactly like what you're saying, it's important to think about this simply because I think a lot of us, and me included, think about our software and our products as tools. We promote them as tools. We market them as tools. And I'm not saying you now have to start changing your language and market
Yeah.
it as a terminal. That wouldn't make any sense. No one would know what you're talking about. But you
Yeah.
knowing that's the relationship and you being conscious of that and being a good steward of the product because of that, I think is the most important part.
Nice. I liked that you brought up those additional options rather than just
Right.
open source everything and give everyone control. If people don't speak the language,
Yeah.
they can't really control that terminal to customize to them. But if you're able to share the ownership and therefore not just listen to your users, but give your users ownership, then they have control over that terminal, which makes it more like a tool. So I like different options of approaching this idea.